And welcome, everyone. My name's Carol Righi. I'm a human-centered designer. I started in the field of human-centered design in the early 1990s at IBM, and I've been doing human-centered design ever since. I've worked across many industries over the last 25 years or so doing design and research and making sure we build the right thing the right way. Currently, I am the human-centered design practice lead at 1904 Labs, and this is John.
And my name is John Royle. Excuse me. I've been at this about 25 plus years in the IT industry. Probably touched every aspect of software development, from requirements gathering to development to architecture to design to delivery over that time frame. I've also had a lot of experience building agile teams along the way, and I'm also a practice lead at 1904 Labs. With that, we want to give her a couple of ground rules for everybody that's in the audience. In this case, we want to encourage you to take pictures, take photographs, and if you have questions about the presentation we're giving, if I can get the feedback from those. That's off. Any questions do you have, go ahead and hashtag us on Twitter at HCDAgile, and we'll answer them. If we don't get to them today, we'll get to them afterwards on the Twitter feed. Or you can go ahead and text it. We can answer those questions too. But at the end, we'll probably just take direct questions from the audience. But just want to make sure you have a stream to answer your questions, make sure they get addressed. We'll also hang around afterwards if you have additional questions and you want to talk to us after the presentation.
And since John and I introduced ourselves, we'd like to know a little bit about who you are. Just by show of hands, how many of you work on the IT side of your organizations? One or two? Okay, excellent. How about on the business side? All right. How many of you work for independent consulting companies, or you're an independent consultant, you work as a consultant? Okay. Couple, there's one in the back. All right, great. So now that we've all introduced ourselves, there are a couple of other people you want to introduce you to now. Their names are Andy and Jeff. And Andy is a business manager at a local St. Louis company. We won't tell you which. You might recognize him. Jeff is the IT professional who works for Andy, and they're about to have my kids use the word cringy conversation. We're going to eavesdrop on it, and then after they have this conversation, we'll come back and talk a little bit about it.
Jeff, come on in. I'm glad I caught up with you. There is something I wanted to ask you about.
Sure, Andy. What can I do for you?
Hey, Jeff, listen, I've been with this company for 6 years now, and maybe it's my imagination, but it seems like every time we fund a project, how can I say this? It never gets done. I mean, it feels like your team is working hard, and I see a lot of activity, but I virtually never see a finished product.
Dude, don't get upset. It's Agile.
Huh?
It's Agile. We deliver working code every 2 weeks. You were included in all the sprint reviews and demos, right?
Yes, and the demos I saw looked fine, but look, we kicked off this project September 1st. Now it's May 16th, we're out of budget, and a huge chunk of the stuff we need hasn't been built yet.
Well, like I said, this is how Agile works. We've been iterating through the backlog you defined as fast as we can. The team has a stable velocity, and everything we're building is tested.
So...
Yeah, so what's the problem? Like I said, this is Agile. Agile is time-boxed.
Yeah, but budgets aren't. They're fixed, and they run out.
Well, okay. But at least the stuff we built looks great, right?
Well, I hate to burst your bubble, but now that you mentioned it...
Really?
You know that last release? That screen where you create a report?
Oh yeah, that one. That report was a work of art. The team was able to include every requirement, and they nailed it. And our lead developer even added extra capability to customize the fields that seemed the most important to us. Now everyone can configure their reports to the tenths, hundredths, and even thousands of a unit. And besides the pie charts that you asked for, the team even added bar charts, scatter plot charts, donut charts, tabular charts, and even pivot tables. It was beautiful.
That's just it. I've been getting calls from our users, and they keep asking me why they can't just create a simple report. This is ridiculous. Can't you put a button somewhere on the screen to do that so they will stop complaining?
I think we can fit a button right about here. Yeah, that looks right. You'll just need to get someone to come along and update the documentation.
So who here, raise show of hands, has had a similar experience, or at least part of a similar experience during your careers? It kind of happens, right? I mean, that's Agile. We certainly iterate. We do what we can. We rotate. We roll the punches. We try and make things as best we can. High quality product, but had some issues. Who can name, or can you throw out some issues maybe they had with this particular piece of it? Oh, and there's prizes if you actually say something. Sir. Correct.
Yes.
Ooh, almost a good shot. Anybody else? Gold plating. Gold plating.
Explain what gold plating is before we give you a T-shirt. Huh?
Gold plating is when a developer or anyone working on the team is adding requirements that weren't previously given without change control.
Perfect.
Whoa.
And you missed. Good shot.
Got close. Sorry about that.
Who said it?
So they had a backlog, but didn't seem like they prioritized the backlog to meet business needs.
Fair enough. Oh, we're getting pretty good at that. Anybody else?
We'll take one more. We're running out of T-shirts. No.
No, we got plenty of T-shirts. Well, we want to identify a few that we looked at when we were looking at this picture, approach and saying what occurred to us. Some of the things that we noticed was funding. So the funding problems from the business's perspective, want to see if they were addressed. I want to try something with everybody here first. I want you to stick your hand out in front of you. Come on, won't hurt you. Put your thumb straight out. Who thought the funding problem was addressed 100%?
Yeah.
Right, not so much. All right, next one, thumbs out again. How about planning? You're on? Yep, planning not so good. And my favorite, what about usability? Yeah, that one, not so good. I saw a few people had a thumbs up there, by the way. You really need counseling to see us afterwards. I'm just saying. But the usability definitely had its issues, so.
So over the years, because these are common problems, and a lot of us have had these problems, we've had a lot of different processes and methodologies that have been proposed to address them. And you know, in my case, and maybe John as well, but I started this field in waterfall, so I'm sure you've all heard of waterfall. In waterfall, we do a lot of upfront planning, right? We make sure we gather all the requirements that we know of. We make up some on our own, but we document them. We have a great spec, right? We cross every T, we dot every I before we even start down the path of delivery. And what usually happens is kind of something that happened with those two guys. Very frequently, we would run out of funding, we'd run out of time, maybe a new competitor would hit the market and we weren't nimble enough to change course. So waterfall really wasn't the solution.
And in my case, I've had the chance to work with a lot of these methodologies over my career, Agile, Scrum, design thinking, Lean, some of the other pieces are on here. I'm sure a lot of you have had experience with some of these along the way. The interesting that I found is that in all the process that I've worked at along these pieces, they're really good at solving specific problems, but they don't necessarily holistically take a look at how to solve the project itself's problems. So with that, when we were going through this, we decided we wanted to find something that worked better. So Agile, one of the things about Agile that's important to note is, and you guys that have been in the Agile field know it runs on a cadence, right? You've got your sprint planning, then you've got your process. So sprint start, sprint end, sprint start, sprint end, sprint start, sprint end. So that's sort of a cadence that goes along. That's one of the things that makes it very efficient. But it's different in a lot of ways from human-centered design and a lot of those aspects. Sort of going to make the assumption a lot of people understand about Agile based on your presence in the IT industry, but want to give you a little bit of information on human-centered design.
So how many of you have a human-centered design function in your workplaces? Okay, how many of you contracted out? How many of you have never used human-centered design in your IT? Okay, so just a quick level set. I want to define it as a set of tools and techniques and methods that are brought to bear on the design and development of a product so that everything the user sees, hears, and touches with regard to the product or a service is useful, usable, and engaging. We focus, human-centered designers do, and the teams do, on humans and their experience all the way out throughout the development life cycle. And we make sure that we're measuring the human experience so that it's not just a subjective kind of thing. So John talked about Agile and human-centered design.
So when Carol and I got together at 1904 Labs, we decided, among other things, we knew there was benefit in Agile. So all the efficiencies that come in with the Agile process. We knew human-centered design focused a lot on effectiveness for end-user pieces. So we decided to bring those two together and fuse them inside a structured Agile process focused on road mapping to address business needs. It sounds somewhat simple, but there's a lot of complexity that's underneath the sheets. I told you at the very beginning, we talked about that music. Actually, we didn't really talk about the music, but can anybody name the music that was playing at the beginning of this presentation? Take 5. Give the man a prize. I'm going to toss that one back. You know what? All right, we'll try it.
Go for it. Go for it. Yeah.
Oh, not so bad. Great. Correct. The answer is Take 5. And it's from an album called Time Out by Dave Brubeck. The interesting thing about this album is every song on this album has a different time signature. When you say time signature, you think the downbeat of Agile, bump, bump, bump. But human-centered design and then within users tends to be more fluid, more jazz-like. So that take 5 is a fusion of jazz and big band, I think, at the time. But basically, the two fused together. It's a 5/4 time signature. There's another one on here, Blue Ronda Ella Turk. That's a 9/8 signature. But every song on this album is a different signature. And they all fuse together beautifully in the same way that human-centered design and Agile can to make something magical when they work together right. And with that, we want to talk about the process itself. So within HCDAgile, we've got it broken into really 4 main phases. So there's benefits of having a phased approach to development. Waterfall had a lot of benefits to it, despite its sort of negative reputation. But there are a lot of things that it did right, a lot of things it did wrong. In our case, we're going to cover the different elements of discovery, envisioning, delivery, and transition, and what those mean in an HCDAgile context.
So we start with discovery. And in discovery, we're trying to understand things at a level that we really just want to get started with the project. We want to meet with the business and understand their wants and needs for actually launching this product in the first place. What are our funding capabilities? What do we have to work with? Who are the humans involved? Who will be affected by the product? And then finally, when we get the go, no-go decision, we'll be able to move on to the proper part of the development life cycle. So once we get the go decision, we move into envisioning. And envisioning is really one of the keys of HCDAgile. It's a really critical process. In envisioning, we're taking a deep dive on the things that we learned about in discovery. We want to understand the needs of the business at a deeper level. We want to understand the technology that's going to be brought to bear on the product. And we're also going to understand who the humans are who are involved in the project. So I want to talk a little bit about these 3 elements here because it's really critical. These 3 elements, you've probably heard of the 3-legged stool. The 3-legged stool in a lot of different contexts. In this context, we're talking about the 3-legged stool as being a balance of the business, the technology, and the humans. And I'll give you an example about why it's important to balance those 3 things and to really understand them thoroughly before we start delivery. I was on a project. I was a human-centered designer. I was hired to do the redesign of a website for a sporting goods store. And as a good human-centered designer, I went out and I met with users. I met with fishermen and campers and hikers, and I learned all about their mental models, how they would approach shopping for what they need, what would bring them delight, what they would like in a shopping experience, and so forth. So I went back after I did all this research, and I met with the sponsor of the project, and they said, this is really great information. I'm going to give you a little bit more information to work with, however. You have to remember that the reason that we got funding for this redesign was because we're launching a new credit card at our company. And we want all of our customers to sign up for this credit card. So don't forget this when you're actually doing your design. So I went back and I'm like, this is really interesting. Okay, I'm thinking if I design a website just based on the users, it would probably look something like this. You can possibly, if you're quiet, you can hear the chirping of the crickets in the background. And can you hear the
Yeah, they're
you can hear the chirping of the crickets in the background, actually. And you can see how customers would get into the mood when they go shopping, that they like to have this nice feel, that they feel like they want to grab their fishing rod. It makes it really easy to shop what they're looking for and so forth. If I had gone a different route and said, I'm just going to address the needs of the business, the homepage of that website would probably look something like this. So balance, and it's kind of a tricky thing, and that's why we talk about envisioning as being such a critical phase in human-centered design, Agile. So in that case, the stool would have looked like this if I disregarded the users and overemphasized the needs of the business. So in the envisioning phase, we're doing that deep dive. We're understanding all the needs of the business. We're understanding the technology. John can talk a little bit about that as well from his perspective, and who the humans are. We engage in a set of activities that we will come out of envisioning phase with a few key deliverables. We'll understand the personas that we're working with, the journeys and the stories of our users, and then we're putting together a roadmap and the first couple of backlogs, first couple of sprints of backlog items to work on through the process. So we don't spend a ton of time in envisioning. We really want to get going in delivery, but we know we need to understand that stuff and that everybody has a shared understanding. Everybody on the project understands where we're going and that we're all aligned.
And just to sort of tag on to that, as Carol mentioned, envisioning includes business, humans, and technology. It really is to get alignment on all 3 of those, not just agreement on what we think we need, but alignment on what we think we need. So all those really are important. And I sort of an analogy or a metaphor in my head is if you are sitting in St. Louis and decide to go on vacation, and you're a pure, just regular Agile shop, not HCDAgile, but just an Agile shop, you pick a direction, and you go and you head towards Texas. And then the users will tell you, no, you want to veer towards California. And the team iterates and changes, and that's an adaptive kind of process. But through envisioneering, the team gets that directional alignment. You really want to go to California. And they can head off starting in that right direction when they get out the door. And that's what envisioneering has that benefit of making sure that we have alignment across a lot of dimensions before we start whole hog on our journey. And with that, I want to take you through, once we're in envisioneering, into the delivery side. Before I get into some of the details of delivery, I want to share a story of my own as well. Many years ago, I worked on a project that was for case management. So think of a legal system where you would say upload documents and records, and they would put in notes on your case, and they could pull it up and do searches on things that you've done. This was the product for the company that I was working for at the time. At the time, though, also, I just got my CSM certification. So if a lot of IT people out there, CSM is a Scrum certification, just that I was a Scrum Master. I was hip deep in Agile. I drank the Kool-Aid. This is the answer. And I was ready to make sure that this project worked a lot better than the other ones at the company I worked with. It did. I had a great team, and the project definitely went better, we thought. Internally, certainly was better from the developer side. Business, though, was kind of like, yeah, it's good. You know, it's good enough. It's okay. You're in the right direction in general. But it was missing something. And, you know, we couldn't really figure it. We kept iterating and demoing and doing our sprint reviews and trying to get understanding and turning when they said turn. But it still was just sort of a, yeah, it's okay, it's going okay kind of project. I left the project about a year into it, transitioned on to something else. Other people came and went over time. But I'd spent a lot of time working on the project and stayed close to the product owner of that particular project. And they told me later that suddenly this project was now the flagship of this particular company. Users were loving it. They were, you know, really, hey, it finally came to fruition. They nailed it. It's going, it's working really well. Can anybody tell me what it was that was added to the team that made it work? This should be an easy one. Come on.
Human-centered design.
Oh, give the man a prize. Human-centered design.
Ta-da.
Now, one thing that was interesting, though, is even when I was on the project, we had a human-centered design group. Most companies do. Most companies have some UI, UX team somewhere or human-centered design team somewhere that provides feedback and insights for the developers. And we did too. We'd say, hey, give us a wireframe or a screen, and we used that screen and wireframe, you know, as best as we could. We, like in the example in the video you saw up front, we sort of kibitzed it a little bit because we could. Yeah, they don't know what they're talking about. We'll do it this way. And so we did all the things that we thought were the right things to do. In this particular instance, though, it wasn't just having the human-centered designer there. That designer was actually embedded on the team. He was hired to the human-centered design group, but didn't have a place to go with that group yet. They didn't have a project for him. So they said, you know what? Why don't you just sit with this group of developers until we have some place for you to go? Guy sat there for about 3 months. Project completely turned around. That was many years ago. That was one of my first insights that says, you know what? Having embedded designers and having embedded HCD on a team is really important to making sure you get that alignment and that directional shift for the users. So that was huge. But that's not enough by itself. The business still has funding and other things that they need to address. They've promised things to the end users. They promised things to their business based on what they agreed to when they got funding for the project. So they created that roadmap and Gantt chart or whatever you want when they promised to get that piece of funding in place. One of the interesting things, I'll show you a slide for the IT people that are in the audience that we talked to. This is a famous quote from Eisenhower. This is one of those battle cries for Agilists everywhere, right? Preparing for battle, plans were essential. But once the battle was joined, plans were useless. This is Agile in a nutshell. You plan for your sprint, you plan to do the work, but when you're actually in the work, in the sprint, actually trying to run it down to ground, something changes, you don't get bent out of shape, you adapt. Right? So adaptation is a very key element of Agile. In the case of Eisenhower, he made a plan to, say, storm a beach, and there's machine gun placement there, and he says, you know what? Maybe we won't go straight up that hill because that's probably not a good idea. Let's go around and come back and approach it the other way. So he adapted. But what he didn't include in his quote, which I thought was, I'm sure he thought about this, I really believe he did, but he didn't include in his quote, but to win the war, continual planning is key. Agile teams on their own, left to their own devices, will adapt and keep veering. Wherever the road takes them, they'll just follow the winds in any direction that it goes. But the business had a plan and a promise that it made budget-wise to complete a project. Once the team adapts and sort of veers off course, they've got to continually visit that plan and pull it back in order to make sure they keep their eye on the prize. Or from a Coveyism, thinking with the end in mind, making sure they've got that main focus there. So roadmap focus is important for delivery. The last part is an agile discipline. This is true of any agile project, not just HCDAgile, and really any project, not just agile, but any project you do at all. Whatever methodology you end up adopting, if you don't have the discipline to follow that process, it's not going to be very successful. So keeping that discipline in mind, about to drop my glasses, is very important to that process. And then with that, the last element we're going to talk about is transition in the life cycle of the project. Some of those processes we talked up front, Six Sigma, I think, has a transition plan that's part of the process. I won't swear to it, but I'm pretty sure it does. But most of the agile processes up there don't, and that's sort of one of those glaring things. People work on projects and they think, this project's going to last forever. This is a great project. We're going to do this 10 years, 20 years. Sooner or later, that project's either going to go away, be sunset and replaced by something else, or maybe transition to another team to support that project, or transition to another team to extend the project. But at some point, there is a transition that takes place. Part of the HCDAgile process includes building a formal transition plan. This is also a very lean process in this section. The idea being basically a checklist. Let's make sure that our security is updated, that our roles are updated, that the accounts are transferred, that the machines are shut down or turned up, that everything is set to go in a structured fashion that we can follow that plan. So we do a transition plan near the end. The other part is, if it is being transferred to another team, we'll do a formal knowledge transfer session. The goal is always to leave whatever team we're leaving behind in a better place than we were. It's not just say, ha, we're out, you're in, good luck, and throw them, toss over the wall and see what they do with it. The goal is really for them to come back and say, okay, wow, and they can be just as successful as we were on that project. And that's part of the transition plan. And then, of course, just the project shut down to the execution of the plan. So with that, now that you know a little bit about HCDAgile, kind of how it works, we want to play another little clip, similar to one at the beginning, of how that conversation might have turned out if they were following an HCDAgile approach.
Hey, Jeff, when we worked together at our last place, every time we funded a project, it never got done. I remember the teams were working hard, but I literally never saw a finished product. Do you think we'll have the same problems here?
Well, I doubt it. Everyone here uses human-centered Agile. HCDAgile is about building the right thing the right way. Here, every project starts with envisioneering. That allows us to understand what we're building and who we're building it for. The team also uses the time to create a roadmap and a backlog to keep us on track.
That makes sense, but you know what used to keep me awake at night? Was that we would get way too far down the path before we found out we weren't going to get done on time or on budget.
Yeah, I remember that. But here, HCDAgile enforces a stronger feedback loop with both the users and the business, so we can better manage expectations and fail fast.
Geez, you don't know how happy I am to hear that. Now remember, at our last place, although the teams were talented and working hard, I got really tired of hearing that users had trouble using our products.
Yeah, that was always painful to hear, being told all the time that sprint reviews were enough to get us good feedback, but you and I both know how well that didn't work. The good news is that here, every product team has a human-centered designer that's actually part of the team. They do research with real users. They design and test mock-ups, and they even create finished visual designs, so that way the team can know that they're building the right thing the right way.
Wow, that's great news. Sounds like this process is a huge step in the right direction. This should make my job a lot easier and take some of the pain out of software development.
So they're very optimistic. Looking back at their first run-through and trying to do a project, what was different this time around, or what's different in terms of the model that they're going to use? Well, with regard to funding, you heard them talking about we can actually stay on track. We can make sure that we're functioning against a roadmap. And they didn't say, well, if we run out of money, we're just going to go back and ask for more. That's not really a good solution, but that's not what we're doing in human-centered Agile. What we're doing is making sure we're tracking to a plan so that we can constantly manage expectations and manage funding properly. So that's better? Yes? Better? I think so. There we go. Okay. As far as the planning is concerned, again, we had a roadmap. They have a roadmap. They're able to make sure that they're tracking all along the project. And of course, and then finally usability. Again, as compared to the earlier screen that you saw before, they have human-centered designers embedded on the team and making sure that the humans are front and center for the entire process.
And with that, we're going to wrap up with some key takeaways. So you've learned a little bit about HCDAgile. You've learned a little bit about how it is differing from regular Agiles, but there are some things we want you to take away in regard to those dimensions we talked about. First one is funding. We want to make sure that the teams are able to fail fast and manage expectations in order to really manage that funding solution, because you can't always go back and say, give us more money. You've got to make those decisions early and say, hey, how can we get done what we can with the budget we have? So that's part of that managing expectations. The other part is planning. Shared understanding and iterative road mapping are key. If you don't revisit the roadmap during the planning sessions, the team will continue to drift off course. And if you don't have that understanding from the end users, you're liable to build something that they don't want. So to keep everybody happy, those two are also key.
And then finally, usability, as we talked about, engaging real users in the process all the way through and having an embedded human-centered designer on the team.
And with that, we want to make sure you enjoyed the presentation today and hopefully can build the right thing the right way. And so thank you very much for attending. We've got some time for questions.
So I have a question. As far as planning, especially in an agile world, what's your strategy to produce that roadmap? Do you time box everything, or how do you deal with that without doing a full deep dive into what you're actually going to develop?
That's a great question. There are a couple of different things that feed into that. It's not just about planning. A lot of it is getting human-centered design understanding up front during envisioneering. So that planning, and Kibitz if I need to interject, but during the envisioneering phase, we're meeting with users, we're adjusting the plan, really reiterating and building a clean roadmap that the business, the users, and the technology team agrees to. So you've got an early contract that keeps it aligned. To keep that contract aligned, now that you've got that direction, within each sprint, the team has a workshop that's part of the mechanism of HCDAgile. So that workshop is roadmap focused. Teams start off their workshopping each sprint, reviewing that roadmap and attacking things that are actually on the roadmap, top of the list on the roadmap. So that kind of scheduled order, as well as addressing things that are key elements or deliverables that are further down the roadmap. You guys have all worked on complex projects before. A lot of times there's, hey, this is great, but in September, we've got to have this key element done. It's really the crux of the project. So we've got to integrate with this other system at the end of this process. So we can build it all, but if we don't integrate them, we fail. So there's some key sort of milestones or deliverables. Those are also addressed during the workshopping phase, and the team will roadmap those out to size them appropriately so you can get a good estimate for what's down. Now, I should say, from the road mapping perspective, the goal is to get about 2 months worth of certainty out of your backlog. Agile, still changes. So you never have complete certainty like you would in a waterfall project with change requests. But during those workshop sessions, the team tries to stay aligned far enough advanced to give the business time to adapt itself. Does that answer the question?
I can also add, we mentioned that in the discovery and envisioneering early on is when a lot of the planning gets done. Part of that is scoping as well. So from a human-centered design perspective, we go in and we say, how much do you know about your users? How much do you know about their requirements and their wants and needs? And so the amount and time we spend in envisioneering and the amount of human-centered resource that we put onto the project is going to be affected by that as well. So that's part of the planning as well.
So how do you incorporate human-centered design into enhancements of legacy systems? So systems where you're kind of constrained with how they were originally built and you're trying to keep the lights on.
So actually, for instance, fixing the plane in flight, I guess, is kind of how it goes. You want to take one? You want me to?
Well, part of that, again, we do envisioneering and we do need to understand the constraints, so that's part of it. It's not just constraints also from a functionality standpoint, but it's constraints on the technology side as well. So we have a box within which we're working. Not everything is going to be greenfield, but we understand that box. We also have, it's actually an advantage of knowing if it's a legacy system, you can do some testing on the existing system, and that can help prioritize your efforts from a human-centered perspective. So that brings a lot of light into what you build into the backlog and what you work on first.
Yeah, and it also, just to Kibitz on that, it may be, again, the devil's in the details for some of that. Some of it may be you can do them in parallel. Maybe sometimes you can do it. Maybe you'll find that really just needs a skin lift or facelift. Maybe it just needs some features reworked to better fit the user's needs. So all of that during envisioneering is try to get the understanding around that to build a plan that can effectively get you from point A to point B. And I've heard this term, the art of the imagined and the art of the possible. I know those terms resonate. So you have the imagining of here's what we really want at the end, but the art of the possible is we're here, we want to get here, let's build a plan to get us there in an iterative fashion through Agile, and that's part of what comes out of envisioneering, is that initial roadmap the team stays aligned to. Does that help? Yeah?
So this approach seems a little bit different than the traditional having a product owner be the person out there to gather that analytics and that information and doing split testing to see if what you're delivering is the right thing at the right time. Is there an advantage to taking this route versus doing an iterative delivery where you're doing split testing and seeing if you're offering out what your customers want?
You're still doing the split testing. You're still doing, those things don't change. The product owner role in this context doesn't change that much. Product owner still controls the overall vision of the project and what adds value to the project. The difference is they're getting informed information to make those decisions. So we're supporting their efforts to make sure that they're putting the right value on the right things. So for instance, as a product owner might look in the example you gave, Carol, with the cha-ching, we want this to be a sales thing for credit cards, so this is our vision. Product owner could easily say, this is what I was told, this is the important thing. Now, not all product owners would do that, but they might, and then they'd go through some iterative testing with their select users. They would say, that's great. It may appeal to a subsection of the business, but understanding the overall, those balancing of the three-legged stool, we can go to the product owner and say, look, you really need something that's not this or this. We need something in between. Let's work together to build that backlog in a more refined way and find different ways to test it, not just through the sprint reviews, which sometimes work. By the way, the thing about sprint reviews is, to sort of kibitz on that a little bit, reviews themselves are still good. I'm not downing anything that's in the existing Agile process. I've been doing Agile a lot of years, and there's a lot of benefit there. But a lot of those pieces are still in place. But the reality is, where reality meets theory, right? The reality is that your end users aren't always available at 8 o'clock in the morning every other Tuesday. They just aren't. I mean, a subsection, maybe your super users are, they'll make themselves available, but the actual people using the software that you're building aren't. So a lot of times you'll have the review, which you need to keep that cadence, but then you'll also end up with another demo or a different kind of session to get their direct feedback. And that's, I think, a lot of the HCD expertise helps facilitate those with testing.
And also from an HCD perspective, and John talked about the devil being in the details. Oh, yeah, we're going to give out T-shirts.
So you got T-shirts for questions.
Yeah, don't forget to get your T-shirt.
You ready?
There you go.
Okay, I'm close.
How do you advocate for embedding HCD in an organization that doesn't already have that established?
So yeah, as John mentioned earlier, the devil's in the details, right? HCD is a different discipline than a typical Agilist. Obviously, we have different skill sets. We also function in a different time frame. And also in part answer to your question, we're trying to do design up front before it's built, even before the sprint. So we're trying to do things like prototyping and testing and getting the answer right and building the thing right, at least at a prototype form, so that we can work with the developers so that when they're ready to bring it into their sprint, it's all designed. So that's a big that's tough. It's not easy to do, and a lot of folks try to do it, but it takes a long time and a lot of discipline. Now, if you've never done anything like that before, even HCD and waterfall, or even having an HCD person somewhere off in the distance that you could bring on once in a while to help, it's a long evolution, and you have to start someplace. And so we can advise you, we could talk afterwards too, in terms of how you get that discipline into your business. But it is very difficult. But I would say start small and don't expect a full integration. This happens after many, many years of companies actually functioning in this fashion.
To spawn off that question, where do you see that position falling within an organization usually? Is it something that might fall into like a PIO, or does it go in IT?
You're talking about HCD, the HCD portion of it?
Talk about how we do it.
Yeah, the HCD engineer.
At 1904, when we're doing our HCD Agile process, the HCD elements are embedded within the team. It is a different skill set, but they sit on the team. They're members of the team. They travel with the team, so they're part of that Agile process. They do the sprint reviews. They do the cycles. They sit with the team 100%. So that makes it easy to manage also. Now, there's a different ratio. It is a specialized skill. Like a DBA is a specialized skill if you really need deep DBA knowledge. But it's a specialized skill. So you end up, in our case, I think we've got about 4 developers to about a half an HCD resource as a starting point. But it really depends on what the system is that you're building, what it does. If it's a high-end system, it's going to need maybe more HCD resource to figure out that balance.
So my question was, with the HCD person sitting on the Agile team, how do they split time with the end users and with the Agile team without one of them consuming all of their time?
Great question.
Yeah, it's a balance, and we have some guidance that when we have HCD folks at 1904 Labs, that we offer them guidance in terms of the number of hours they need to spend on all of these different things. And it really, we have a joke in HCD. The answer to every question is it depends, right? So it really depends on what they're doing, where they are in the life cycle. Sometimes early on in the development life cycle, they're going to be spending more time with users, learning things, getting their requirements, understanding their mental models. Later on, they may be doing things like more prototypes, working with the team. But the whole time, as John said, they're sitting with the team. So even if they're doing research most of the day, their team member can turn around and say, hey, I'm trying to build this thing. Do you have some advice? Can you give us some guidance on that? So it really is, it's an interesting way to function. It's not cut and dry, but it's really more about planning within the sprints.
There's two stages that the HCD people do. They're both strategic in the sense that they're giving us the direction and the alignment and working with the end users, but they also have a tactical side, providing, say, specific wireframes and things to accelerate the team. So they're more of an accelerator for the team, for the development output of the team. That's one of their functions. The other thing is, has anybody here heard of rolling wave theory from an Agile perspective? A few people? So a lot of how that's done, at least in our process, is through a rolling wave process. What that really means is the designers are designing stuff for sprint 2 while the developers are developing in sprint 1. So by the time they get to sprint 2, the stuff's ready for them. The designers then start working on sprint 3, and they just roll over each other throughout the process. Sometimes those are long, sometimes it's 2-3 sprints, depending on research, so it's not exactly bump, bump, bump cadence. But there is that sort of cadence to make sure they're ahead of the development to make sure that they're effective. And don't let me hit you in front, please. You ready?
How have you pitched selling HCD to executives?
That's a great question. You want to tackle it or you want me to?
Why don't you start?
My perspective, this is my take, it works. A lot of systems that are today, for whatever, whether you're waterfall or Agile, and Agile was sort of hyper-sold as the answer. And it certainly brought the bar a lot closer to where it needs to be and certainly addresses a lot of problems. But the HCDAgile aspect, you have to have that designer to get effective outcomes, not just output from a team, but outcomes from the team. And that's your goal. You want to have both effectiveness and efficiency together. And that's sort of the tact I would take if I was talking to some of those people. Make sure if that's what you want. Now, if all you want is, hey, more bodies, more stuff done, maybe this isn't the right approach. But if you want the right stuff done, this is a good approach to follow.
And the reason I sighed so heavily.
Okay, people in the back row, I may fall short on this one, so.
Is that, whoa.
Oh, see,
okay.
that's what I'm talking about. It's just that arm.
Nobody was injured in the making of this session.
No, that's the important
that's
part.
What we want
Do
to
we have time for one more question, Sean?
I'm going to finish answering this.
Oh,
Hold on a second, John. I wanted to address one other aspect of his question. The reason I sighed so heavily when you asked that is because I've been an independent consultant for almost my entire career, and selling HCD is something I had to do every day. And it is a difficult thing. It's a lot easier to sell it to folks who've seen it in action before because they become instant believers. As John said, it works. And once they see it works, it's a lot easier to sell. But it's a lot easier now than it was 25 years ago. I think the whole industry is changing and understands a lot more the value of HCD.
Do you find that an HCD engineer can be embedded in more than one project at a time? And if not, why not?
Ideally, I would love to have only one project because it's very difficult to switch mental sets if you're working on two very different things. It's difficult from a time management perspective as well. But I think two is doable, especially when there's not a heavy-duty need for, say, unique research. It's a legacy product. So, but I would say, ideally it would be one resource per project.
Same sort of thing you might have with a developer. Can a developer work on two projects at a time? The answer is yes, but they're not necessarily optimal in that set.
So with that, I want to thank you for taking your time to come listen and learn a little bit about HCDAgile. John and Carol will obviously be available after the session if you have further questions. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, guys.